The Soviet Union built itself on a promise of liberation, equality, and justice for the working class. But beneath the revolutionary rhetoric lay a legal system so Byzantine, so arbitrary, and so terrifying that millions of ordinary citizens found themselves branded as criminals for actions that in any other society would have been utterly mundane or even commendable. The laws that sent people to the Gulag were not always about political dissent or espionage. Sometimes they were about being late to work. Sometimes they were about telling a joke. Sometimes they were simply about surviving. On the 26th of June, 1940, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet issued a decree that would reshape the lives of every Soviet worker. It mandated that unauthorized absence from work, even for a single day, could result in up to 6 months of corrective labor at 25% reduced wages. Being more than 20 minutes late was treated as absenteeism. This was not a wartime emergency measure, though war would come soon enough. This was peacetime legislation designed to militarize labor itself. The decree came at a moment when Stalin's industrialization drive demanded maximum output, when the factories of the Urals and the mines of the Donbas were supposed to outproduce the capitalist West, and when any slackening of pace was seen as sabotage against the socialist project itself. Within the first year of this decree, millions of Soviet citizens were prosecuted. The courts processed cases with assembly line efficiency. A worker who overslept because of illness, who missed the tram because of snow, who stayed home to care for a sick child, found themselves standing before a judge and receiving a sentence that would destroy their family's income and mark them permanently as unreliable in the eyes of the state. The logic was simple and brutal. The Soviet economy was planned down to the last bolt and bushel. Every worker was a cog in a vast machine, and the machine could not tolerate irregularity. But the human cost was staggering. Families went hungry when breadwinners had their wages cut. Children were left unsupervised when mothers were forced into corrective labor brigades. The social fabric frayed under the weight of a law that treated human beings as interchangeable units of production. And this was just one law among thousands. Consider the fate of those who fell under Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, a piece of legislation so elastic and so vague that it could ensnare virtually anyone. Article 58, introduced in 1927 and expanded repeatedly throughout the Stalin era, defined counter-revolutionary activity in terms so broad that they defied meaningful interpretation. Subsection 10 covered anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. What constituted agitation? A critical remark about food shortages, a joke about Stalin's mustache, a private conversation in which someone expressed doubt about the success of collectivization. The NKVD and later the KGB maintained vast networks of informers who reported such conversations, and the courts accepted denunciations as evidence. No physical proof was required. The testimony of a single informer, who might have been motivated by personal grudges, jealousy, or the desire to curry favor with authorities, could be enough to secure a conviction. Subsection 14 of Article 58 addressed counter-revolutionary sabotage, defined as deliberate failure to perform duties or intentionally careless performance with the aim of weakening state power. This provision turned every workplace accident, every production shortfall, every quality control failure into potential evidence of treason. When a tractor broke down on a collective farm, the mechanic could be accused of sabotage. When a factory failed to meet its quota, the manager could be charged with wrecking. The burden of proof was reversed. The accused had to demonstrate that their failure was genuinely accidental, not the result of counter-revolutionary intent. In practice, this was nearly impossible. How do you prove what was in your mind? How do you demonstrate innocence when the system presumes guilt? The case of industrial engineer Vladimir Mikhailovich Petrov illustrates the absurdity and tragedy of these sabotage prosecutions. In 1937, Petrov was the chief engineer at a textile factory in Ivanovo, one of the Soviet Union's major manufacturing centers. The factory had been assigned an ambitious production target as part of the third five-year plan. Petrov worked 16-hour days trying to meet the quota, but the machinery was old, spare parts were scarce, and the workforce was exhausted. In October of that year, a loom broke down during a critical production run, causing the factory to miss its monthly target by 3%. Petrov was arrested within 48 hours. The NKVD interrogators did not ask him about maintenance schedules or supply chain problems. They asked him which foreign intelligence service he was working for. They asked him who else was part of his sabotage network. They asked him these questions for 72 hours straight while he stood in a freezing cell without sleep. Eventually, Petrov signed a confession stating that he had deliberately caused the breakdown to undermine Soviet industrial capacity. He was sentenced to 10 years in the Kolyma gold mines. He died there in 1941, age 34, his body broken by labor in temperatures that regularly dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Petrov was one of thousands of engineers, managers, and technicians arrested during the Great Terror on charges of industrial sabotage. Stalin's regime needed scapegoats for the chronic inefficiencies of the planned economy, and the technical intelligentsia provided convenient targets. These were people who understood how things actually worked, who knew that the production targets were often impossible, who recognized that the system itself was dysfunctional. Their knowledge made them dangerous. Better to eliminate them and blame failures on sabotage than to acknowledge that central planning had fundamental flaws. But Article 58 reached far beyond the industrial sector. Subsection 1, a covered treason, which for Soviet citizens included any action that weakened the military power of the USSR. During the Second World War and in the years immediately following, this provision was used to prosecute Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans. The logic was perverse, but consistent with Stalin's worldview. In Order No. 227, issued in August 1941, Stalin declared that there were no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors and deserters. Any soldier who surrendered rather than fighting to the death was presumed to have done so with counter-revolutionary intent. When the Red Army liberated German POW camps in 1944 and 1945, the Soviet prisoners inside were not greeted as victims or heroes. They were interrogated by Smersh counterintelligence units. Many were arrested on the spot. Hundreds of thousands were sent not home, but to filtration camps where they were processed for potential prosecution under Article 58. Those who had cooperated with the Germans in any way, even under duress, even to survive, faced execution or 25-year sentences. But even those who had simply endured captivity without collaboration were often sentenced to 6 or 8 years in the Gulag for having allowed themselves to be captured. The state's position was clear. Your duty was to die, not to survive. Lieutenant Mikhail Devyatayev provides a remarkable counterpoint to this brutal logic. Devyatayev was a Soviet fighter pilot who was shot down over German-occupied territory in July 1944. He was captured and sent to a series of POW camps, eventually ending up at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. In February 1945, he and 9 other prisoners escaped by hijacking a German Heinkel He-111 bomber and flying it back to Soviet lines. This was an act of extraordinary courage and skill. Devyatayev brought valuable intelligence about German rocket development at Peenemünde. He should have been celebrated as a hero. Instead, he was immediately arrested and interrogated for weeks. The Smersh officers wanted to know why he had been sent to Sachsenhausen, a camp for political prisoners and special cases. They suspected he had agreed to work for German intelligence. Only the intervention of other prisoners who confirmed his story and the value of the intelligence he provided saved him from prosecution. Even so, he was not officially recognized as a hero until 1957, after Stalin's death, when he finally received the title Hero of the Soviet Union. For 12 years, his reward for an extraordinary act of resistance was suspicion and official silence. The paranoia extended to civilians as well. Article 58, subsection 10, was used to prosecute people for what the Soviet state called anti-Soviet conversations. In practice, this meant that any critical statement, even in private, could result in arrest if reported by an informer. The NKVD cultivated informers everywhere. In apartment buildings, in workplaces, in schools, even within families. Children were encouraged to report on their parents. Spouses denounced each other. The result was a society where trust became a luxury no one could afford. People developed elaborate codes for discussing sensitive topics, spoke in whispers even in their own homes, and learned to watch every word. But the net was cast so wide that it was nearly impossible to avoid. Anna Mikhailovna Larina, the widow of Bolshevik leader Nikolai Bukharin, spent 18 years in camps and exile, partly because of things she had said in private conversations before her husband's arrest in 1937. During her interrogation, NKVD officers confronted her with detailed accounts of discussions she had had with friends years earlier, discussions in which she had expressed mild doubts about certain policies. These conversations, held in private apartments with people she trusted, had been reported to the secret police by informers. The information had been filed away, waiting for the moment when it would be useful. When Bukharin fell from power and was arrested as part of the Great Purge, Larina's old conversations became evidence of her own counter-revolutionary tendencies. She was sentenced to 8 years in the camps, though she would end up serving much longer through repeated extensions and reclassifications of her sentence. She survived, barely, and after Stalin's death became one of the most important memoirists of the Gulag era. But her case illustrates how the Soviet legal system weaponized everyday conversation. The state also criminalized contact with foreigners under Article 58. Any Soviet citizen who communicated with foreign nationals without official authorization could be prosecuted for espionage or for weakening the state. This law was applied with particular severity to those who had relatives abroad. After the Second World War, when the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states and parts of Poland, Romania, and Finland, millions of Soviet citizens suddenly had family members living in capitalist countries. Writing to them, receiving letters from them, or accepting packages from them could trigger investigation. People who received care packages from relatives in America or Canada during the post-war famine years sometimes found themselves arrested for maintaining suspicious foreign contacts. The packages themselves, filled with food, clothing, and medicine, were confiscated as evidence. The recipients were interrogated about what information they had provided to their foreign relatives, what secrets they might have revealed, what intelligence networks they were part of. The idea that someone might simply be writing to their sister or their cousin was treated as a naive cover story. In the Soviet worldview of the late Stalin period, there were no innocent contacts with the West. Every interaction was a potential vector for espionage. The criminalization of religion provides another window into the outrageous scope of Soviet law. The Soviet Constitution technically guaranteed freedom of conscience, but in practice, religious activity was severely restricted and often prosecuted. The law on religious associations, passed in 1929, prohibited religious organizations from engaging in any activity beyond worship services. They could not provide charity, could not organize youth groups, could not run schools, could not publish literature without state approval, could not even meet for Bible study or prayer outside of registered church buildings. Clergy were classified as non-working elements and denied ration cards during periods of shortage. They were excluded from housing allocation lists. Their children were barred from higher education. And these were the legal restrictions. Beyond them lay a vast apparatus of informal persecution and outright prosecution. Priests, rabbis, imams, and Buddhist monks were arrested by the tens of thousands during the 1930s on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. The charge was often that they were using religion to undermine Soviet power, but the evidence was simply that they were performing religious functions, saying Mass, conducting a circumcision, leading prayers, teaching children about faith. These activities were treated as anti-Soviet agitation. During the Great Terror, the NKVD carried out targeted operations against religious leaders. Order number 00447, issued in July 1937, specifically identified clergy as one of several categories of people to be arrested and either executed or sent to camps. The order established quotas for each region. NKVD chiefs were expected to arrest a certain number of kulaks, a certain number of former White Army members, and a certain number of religious leaders. The quotas created an incentive to find counter-revolutionaries, whether they existed or not. If a region had already arrested all its obvious targets, the NKVD would expand the criteria. Devout lay people were arrested as religious fanatics. People who had attended church services were arrested as members of counter-revolutionary religious organizations. The absurdity reached its peak when people were arrested for possessing icons or religious books in their homes, items that had been legal to own and that many families had possessed for generations. Father Pavel Florensky, a brilliant mathematician, theologian, and philosopher, was arrested in 1933 and charged with belonging to a counter-revolutionary organization. The evidence was that he was a priest and that he had continued to write theological works after the revolution. Florensky was one of the most gifted intellectuals of his generation, a man who had made significant contributions to mathematics and physics as well as theology. None of that mattered. He was sentenced to 10 years in the camps and sent to Solovki, the notorious prison camp on an island in the White Sea. Even in the camps, his brilliance was recognized. He was assigned to work in a laboratory studying iodine extraction from seaweed. And he made significant scientific contributions even as a prisoner. But in 1937, during the height of the Great Terror, he was transferred to a camp near Leningrad and executed by firing squad on December 8th. He was 55 years old. His crime was being a priest who refused to renounce his faith. The Soviet state also prosecuted people for economic crimes that in any other context would be considered survival strategies. The Law of 7/8, officially the Decree of August 7, 1932, made theft of socialist property punishable by death or 10 years imprisonment. The law was ostensibly aimed at preventing theft from collective farms and state enterprises, but it was applied with stunning breadth. Collective farmers who took grain from the fields they worked, even small amounts to feed their starving families, were prosecuted under this law. During the famine of 1932 and 1933, when millions died of starvation in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, desperate people were shot or imprisoned for taking food from the collective farms. The state's position was that all agricultural production belonged to the state, and taking any of it, even to prevent your own death, was theft. Children were prosecuted under this law. The most infamous case involved Pavlik Morozov, a 13-year-old boy who was turned into a propaganda hero after he supposedly denounced his father for hiding grain from the collective farm. The father was arrested and executed. Pavlik himself was later killed, allegedly by relatives seeking revenge. And the Soviet state made him a martyr for socialist vigilance. The story was almost certainly embellished or fabricated, but it served its purpose. It taught Soviet children that loyalty to the state superseded loyalty to family, and that even taking food to survive was a crime against socialism. The law was applied in absurd cases. Workers who took a piece of wood from a factory to repair their homes were prosecuted for theft of socialist property. Farmers who kept back a few potatoes from the collective harvest to feed their children faced 10-year sentences. The records are full of such cases. In 1933, a woman named Maria Kovalenko was sentenced to 10 years for taking 2 kilograms of wheat from the collective farm where she worked. Her 3 children were sent to an orphanage. She died in the camps in 1935. Her crime was trying to feed her family during a famine that the state itself had largely caused through forced collectivization and excessive grain requisitions. The Soviet Union also criminalized what it called parasitism, the refusal to engage in socially useful labor. A series of laws passed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, after Stalin's death, but while the system remained fundamentally unchanged, mandated that all able-bodied adults had to be employed in state-approved work. Those who were not could be prosecuted, fined, and exiled to remote regions where labor was needed. The law was ostensibly aimed at preventing people from living off unearned income or engaging in black market activity, but it was used to prosecute artists, writers, and intellectuals whose work did not fit into official categories. Joseph Brodsky, who would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature, was prosecuted for parasitism in 1964. He was as a poet, but the Soviet authorities did not recognize poetry as real work unless you were a member of the official writers' union and produced verse that conformed to socialist realist principles. Brodsky's poetry was modernist, influenced by Western writers, and deeply personal rather than political. At his trial, the judge asked him who had certified him as a poet. Brodsky replied that he thought it came from God. He was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor in the Arkhangelsk region. International pressure eventually secured his release after 18 months, but the case illustrated how the Soviet system criminalized independent creative work. The parasitism laws were also used against religious believers who had been fired from their jobs because of their faith. If you were dismissed from your position for refusing to renounce your religious beliefs and then could not find other employment because your record marked you as a religious person, you could be prosecuted for parasitism. The logic was circular and inescapable. The state created the conditions that made employment impossible, then punished you for not being employed. The cumulative effect of these laws was a society where almost everyone was technically a criminal. The legal scholar Harold Berman, who studied the Soviet legal system extensively, noted that the laws were so broad and so numerous that it was nearly impossible for any Soviet citizen to go through life without violating some regulation. This was not a bug in the system, it was a feature. When everyone is guilty of something, the state has maximum power to decide who gets punished. The law becomes a tool of control rather than a framework for justice. You could be a model Soviet citizen, working hard, supporting the regime, saying all the right things in public, and still be arrested if someone decided you were a problem. The law would provide the pretext. There would always be some regulation you had violated, some conversation you had that could be reinterpreted as agitation, some mistake at work that could be classified as sabotage. The statistics are staggering. Between 1921 and 1953, approximately 20 million people passed through the Gulag system. Another 6 million were sent into internal exile. Roughly 750,000 were executed, though the true number is likely higher. These figures include political prisoners prosecuted under Article 58 and other political charges, but they also include millions prosecuted under the ordinary criminal code for offenses like theft, absenteeism, and parasitism. The distinction between political and criminal prisoners was often meaningless. A person prosecuted for theft of socialist property because they took food during a famine was as much a victim of political repression as someone prosecuted for anti-Soviet agitation. The system began to change after Stalin's death in 1953. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 acknowledged some of the excesses of the Stalin era and initiated a process of de-Stalinization. Millions of prisoners were released from the camps during the late 1950s. Some of the most draconian laws were repealed or modified. The law on absenteeism was relaxed. Article 58 was eventually replaced with less sweeping provisions in the 1961 Criminal Code. But the fundamental structure remained. The Soviet Union continued to prosecute dissidents, religious believers, and independent thinkers throughout its existence. The methods became somewhat less brutal, the numbers somewhat smaller, but the principle that the state could criminalize thought and conscience persisted until the very end. The legacy of these outrageous laws extends beyond the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The legal systems of post-Soviet states still bear traces of this history. More broadly, the Soviet experience demonstrates how law can be weaponized, how justice can be perverted into an instrument of control, and how ordinary people can be transformed into criminals by a state that views every aspect of life as subject to political regulation. The laws that sent millions to the Gulag were not aberrations. They were the logical expression of a system that prioritized state power over individual rights, that treated human beings as resources to be managed rather than as people with inherent dignity, and that could not tolerate any space for independent thought or action. Understanding these laws and their consequences is essential not just for making sense of Soviet history, but for recognizing the dangers that arise whenever legal systems abandon the principle that law should protect people rather than empower the state to destroy them. The millions who suffered under these outrageous laws deserve to be remembered, and their stories demand that we remain vigilant against any system that treats justice as subordinate to power.